Welcome to this new Tech Captains episode. So today our guest is Tim Richardson, CTO at Playroll, a leading employer of record platform, which Tim will tell us more during the podcast. So Tim is known for his leadership at Unibuddy as VP of Engineering. He also spent several years at ClearScore, which is a famous credit scoring company. And he has an impressive track record of transforming tech services and excelling in team development. So, Tim, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
That's great. I mean, with Gareth, we have a lot of questions for you today. But let me start by ask you, how does one become CTO like that after such a long career, and what's led you to Playroll? Was it the company, the mission, the role? I mean, you've worked in many different companies of different sizes.
Yes. So actually, I was working in my second job back in 2005 when I realized that in order to have the big impact I wanted on the sorts of projects and products that make a change, that I would aim for leadership. So I actually decided I wanted to be a CTO back almost 19 years ago. So it took a while to get here, but through a bunch of great opportunities along the way, and really finding out what my special niche was, where I could add value, where I could work best with teams, the sorts of teams I really wanted to work with. And it was a long and gradual, journey with loads of great input from loads of great mentors and managers and colleagues and friends along the way. For Playroll is a smaller company than the last few I've worked at, although actually when I started at ClearScore, it was of a similar size. There were a couple of things, because as you say, I've worked across a broad series of companies that do lots of different things. I was really attracted by sort of the polish of what has been achieved in a very short period of time. So there's a great mission, right? Enabling a borderless economy, enabling people to access talent pools and to access companies and employment around the world is a great mission. But employer of records and payroll and all the things that go with it are really complex, and it's a big technical challenge to deliver that across almost around about 200 countries for all sorts of different customers, all sorts of different employees, contractors, and the product has to be there, right? Because you can't be inaccurate, you can't not pay people on time, you can't get these things wrong, and it was just a really impressive solution and platform that had been put in place with all of the activities around this. A great team. It was a really exciting opportunity.
That's interesting. Can you tell us a bit more about the tech stack that's in place?
Yes, so we have quite a light tech stack, actually. We have all of our applications, all of our systems are developed in TypeScript. And we use a hybrid stack, which uses a lot of serverless for our back-end services, and Next.js applications for our client-facing and internal employee-facing applications. We're just building out our data stack. So obviously our solution is data-powered. We have our Postgres database in an AWS stack. But we've recently hired our first data specialist, and we're building out our data platform for analytics and for being able to use the data that we generate to provide a better service for our customers and employees.
How hands-on are you on this tech stack that you personally do? Because obviously you have a great experience in management and large teams, but here, even if you have a higher title, I would say the company is smaller, so you're more in the trenches. So how much are you really involved there?
Sometimes it worries me a little bit, particularly moving from another company into an unfamiliar tech stack. I'm not particularly hands-on at present. I don't come from the software engineer background. I come from the platform background. I've got a great team with me, and I try and get involved as much as I can, but I'm not contributing to the code base yet. I sort of fit in more at the sort of architectural and operational level at present, although I'm looking to get more involved. So when there's an opportunity to get involved in some troubleshooting or designing a new part of the platform, I get involved as much as I can.
So just, it was interesting. So it sounded like you have a very homogeneous choice of language then. So you're using TypeScript, front end, back end, which is interesting. And actually, I'm kind of a big fan of that, right? Because one of the things I think people don't always appreciate is the cost of hiring, the cost of being able to then, being able to move people between different teams. You haven't got to have someone who's a specialist in something else, in Python or Java or whatever. So there's a big advantage to having that really homogeneous language choice. But I'm interested because you just said, you've hired your first data scientist. Are they going to be working in TypeScript, or are you going to have them in Python, or what are your plans there?
Well, so far he's working in TypeScript. I mean, he's building out the platform. I think over time, particularly right now, we don't have any native offering. Everything is presented via web applications. So maybe there'll be some need for diversification over time. I think it's great because everyone can understand what everyone else is doing, and people can move around the platform pretty fluidly, which is great for a company at our stage with a relatively small team, but quite a broad, range of services which people are working on. I think the other side of that is that it becomes a bit harder to encourage the types of conversations that you normally get from sort of the guild and chapter type of setup that you have in a slightly larger organization, to have developers and software engineers talking to each other about their particular craft and driving that themselves. This is something where we have to sort of force it a little bit more, because there isn't that sort of interest in specific disciplines or specific technologies that causes people to naturally gravitate to each other.
Right. And you mentioned serverless, so you're using lambdas and step functions and all that lovely stuff on AWS?
Yes, for the bulk of our backend services.
And to bounce back on that, you mentioned a few minutes ago that there's a lot of big challenges, and you briefly mentioned paying salaries on time, obviously. But can you expand maybe a bit more on the big challenges that you face technically that could have a really bad impact if it was not running correctly, and what kind of redundancy you put in place, etc.
Yes, so I think the challenge is really providing flexibility. So one of the things that differentiates, our employer of record platform is that it provides huge flexibility for a very diverse range of customers and employees, and everything gets multiplied by many times, because each country has different tax regimes, different rules and regulations about employment, different holiday dates, public holidays, and all of this needs to be delivered, as I said, very accurately, right? You can't not pay people on time, and customers need to know how much they're going to pay to employ a particular person over time. There are lots of components and bits and pieces of the platform, in all sorts of areas, right? Payroll, benefits, leave management, termination, changes, and they all have to fit into this ongoing cycle, and it's all the differences which need to be taken into account for. So someone might change their salary, have their salary changed, or be paid a bonus at short notice, or if if a contract is terminated or someone leaves, you have to calculate, once payroll's already been launched, how their accrued leave is going to be paid, or how much allowance they have left, and be able to make these adjustments in something that's already been calculated. So there's a lot of in and out of cycle adjustments to make sure that we deliver everything accurately and on time.
That makes sense. And I have another question about you've been working in the tech world for more than 20 years now. You graduated from Cambridge and Bristol, late 90s, early 2000s. And how have you seen the industry evolve since you started?
So one thing I should point out, I didn't actually graduate from these universities. I attended them. I had a very rocky start. I was very fortunate actually to move into a tech career. It's The two main things that I've seen is because I came from a platform background. So I actually got into my first job. I was at university and I needed a summer job so I could stay in the city rather than going back to the countryside to spend 10 weeks, in my family home. And I went to the local temping agency and I said, I've got these tech skills. I'm studying, systems engineering. Um, what have you got? And they said, well, would you like to be a systems administrator? And I said, sure, yeah, what's one of those? And then they told me, and I spoke to the company. I actually stayed at that company for 4.5 years. And in that area, things were very hands-on and bespoke. It was great because I was one systems administrator providing the sort of the build, testing, and training infrastructure for a speech recognition software solution, automotive speech recognition solution. So it was really quite a high tech and very niche application. And everything was very bespoke, servers had names, systems and pipelines were handcrafted. And over time, right, because I spent a lot of time working in data centers, which you were managing hands-on, small footprint, data centers for medium-sized companies, just from there to what you see today in cloud and the levels of automation, repeatability, and the widespread availability to anyone who knows a bit of JavaScript, of large footprint infrastructure and capabilities, has been a huge change. The other thing is really, it started off with the DevOps movement. Everyone could see the problems and the challenges, but today it's just how we work, and it's not just how we work; it's how increasingly everyone works in technology and wider out into all areas of industry. And that's the really big change that I've seen, just the change in the way of working together more across disciplines and towards shared goals rather than in silos.
And you mentioned DevOps and automation. And one of the things I saw in your profile, which I'd never seen before, it's one of the reasons I love doing this podcast. I learn new things. You had, I read it as noops. I'm like, what is noops? It's no ops, right? So there's this whole this whole idea of no ops, and which I hadn't heard of before, and I get it when I read it. But so first of all, could you kind of explain to people what no ops actually is? And my comment is it really aspirational rather than a realistic goal?
We probably refer to it as platform as a product. So when I was working at ClearScore, which is when we pursued as a team, we pursued this no ops goal. We started off very hands-on, and we started off with it was actually called the DevOps team. Right, we were responsible for specific areas which we wished to delegate. Right, the releases. I remember we were able to release once or twice a month, maybe, or maybe once every week or so. And it was very hands-on, and it was a handover, and we operated that, and then we handed it over to the QAs, and then we handed it back to the devs if there were issues with releases. And of course, we went through various phases. We had a big drive to a you build it, you run it approach. We built our first orchestrated containerized platform so that developers could own their own applications and deploy at will, and basically own the life cycle more and more and more. But this was at a time when we were learning about SRE, and we went back and forth a lot. Right? Do we have infrastructure specialists in the squads, in the teams? Do we actually have a team that centrally manages? What do we want? And what we really wanted was to be able to build great platform capabilities that could support a business that would scale and keep on scaling, but also to empower the teams to only talk to us. Well, no, it's not true. We wanted to talk all the time because we still continued to support with all of the operations, and we continued to learn together. But we wanted to be developing new capabilities. So what we did is, when we built our first Kubernetes platform, for example, through the use of operators, we provided the ability through config for developers to request infrastructure rather than requesting infrastructure from us to go and implement on a sort of bespoke or ad hoc basis. So that was our vision for no ops, was effectively to move towards platform as a product, where we could build these capabilities out, and then they could be reused and put together in different ways by our development teams.
Oh, okay, yeah. So it is a bit of a misnomer then, isn't it, really? It's kind of reducing the amount of DevOps you would actually need. I mean, you've got a bunch of IAC, you've got some templates. If you want to go roll out some other infrastructure as a regular developer, you can just go run that if you want to. But
yes, exactly. And the what we wanted was that, although obviously, right, developers, it's great when they can, it's part of the stack, it's part of the requirement to understand how cloud infrastructure works and how IAC works. But we could provide, a config-based, like a YAML-based interface to creating, repeatable units of platform. Obviously, if someone needed a new type of database or a new type of queue, then, we'd have to develop that. But it was more akin to, to product development, where it was in our roadmap and we developed something that we then, provided as a product to be consumed by the various teams in different ways.
Got it. Yeah.
Tim, you mentioned that you spent time at the University of Cambridge and Bristol, but you didn't actually graduate. So, I wanted to ask you for advice for younger techies who want to get into the tech world. But I think your insight would be particularly interesting because you did try the university. It was not for you for some reason that you will tell us, and still you managed to do a successful career in that industry.
Yes, so I I was very fortunate in my schooling before I went to university, and we learnt, I think, a lot more than we needed to learn for the levels of education that you go through in the UK. The A levels, which are the senior qualifications you get when you're 18, 19. We really learnt an awful lot, some university level maths, etc. And I believed that I wanted to study engineering, and I had got career advice which suggested that generic engineering was for me. It wasn't, and I I was learning stuff that I already knew, although I was learning a lot of stuff that I didn't know. At University of Cambridge, right, you're learning a lot of interesting things, and I just fell in love with computing, and there wasn't enough of that in that first part of the course for me. So I wanted to move to computing, and there were opportunities, but I was very young. I was 17, 18, and they said, right, you can go away for a year, come back, start again. And I thought, oh no, all my friends are going to be 2 years ahead of me. I don't want to do that. That's why I skipped. But I think at that point, I was then going back and learning the same things again. Whereas when I got this summer job, which turned into a 4-year occupation, I was enjoying so much just being in the real world and working with people who were already great software engineers on this really, then very interesting product, the speech recognition product, back in 2001. It was something, when they came to me and said, there's a permanent job here, it was a no-brainer to me. And to the great disappointment, of course, of my parents, but I think dealing with that disappointment, right, being a disappointment to my family, but also in myself, because for a little bit more efforts I could have done both in parallel and done what I was supposed to do, it's given me a bit of a perspective, because you go through multiple roles, you're quite mobile in technology, and sometimes it doesn't work out the way you thought it was going to, and I have that perspective to be able to just tell when it's not the right, when it's not quite right, and when actually it's better to move on.
So what would you recommend to someone, a 17-year-old coming to you today for advice? Do I apply to uni to start next year, or do I just go work?
I think different people have obviously different approaches. It's definitely worth it. You learn a lot, you gain a lot of life experience, and for most people it works out very well. And actually, that's one of the things that attracted me, apart from a really great leadership team and team in general. That's what attracted me to go and work at Unibuddy, which was that I didn't have that kind of support back when I was 17. And I think it's so important to provide people with the context they need to make the right choice. Because it's the first big independent decision you make, and it can have a big impact on where you go.
Yeah, and it's just sort of continuing on the careers thing. So your previous company, you were a VP of engineering. How do you see that role as being different from being a CTO now that you're a CTO?
I think in that particular case, it wasn't particularly different. The co-founder and CTO, who had been at the company for a long time, was thinking about moving on to his next challenge, to his next CTO position. So actually, I was brought in, and we sort of transitioned and crossed over a period of several months before I effectively became the only technology representative on the exec team. So it was really the very best of both worlds. It wasn't a normal VP of engineering role because I had all of this great experience of working with a really, really good CTO, and then also taking up the reins and running the engineering team on my own with great support throughout that period.
Okay.
In general, right, because I used to be part of, again, through that company, actually one of the companies that, one of the organizations that brings CTOs together, 7 CTOs, if I'm able to mention the name. I was part of a forum group there, and I explored what it meant, right? So I had this angst over 2021 and 22. I wanted to be a real CTO, and I was talking to these really experienced, great guys, 7 of them in this forum, and our great facilitator, and say, well, what do I need to do this year to be a proper CTO? And I learned an awful lot from them. I think, to be honest, right, at the VP of engineering level, it means a lot of different things to different companies and different people, and there are all sorts of different opportunities and footprints of that role.
So what has been your biggest surprise then, now that you're CTO here at Playroll?
So I think the biggest, it's not a surprise, but the biggest challenge for me, and the co-founder who hired me always said, this we might be a little bit too early for you at this point. And I was thinking, when I joined, well, I've been at companies that were about this stage before, right? And obviously we went through growth periods and got to to much larger sizes. But for me, it was actually really the reality when the buck stops with you, for technology at least. I know we've got a very supportive exec team. We work together very, very closely. But it's when the buck stops with you and you're used to working with larger teams, there's a lot less give, right? There's a lot less natural tension for organizations and processes and problems to sort of solve themselves just through, the application of guidance. Everything's it's very real. And getting into that mindset is great. But it was a bit of a big shift for me coming back to a smaller team.
How do you organize the team at Playroll then?
I remember in some of the companies I worked at where they were a bit smaller when I joined, thinking it took us quite a long time to change how our organizations works. And now I'm definitely feeling why it takes a while, because there's so much to do, so much foundational work, so many things you have to get right to be able to scale and reorganize. We're currently one team. So actually we do all of the work across all of the different products and services as developers who move from sort of project to project. And we actually have, our product team, although there are multiple members of that team, they work within the same, engineering and product team. We're at a point where that's becoming harder to support. So I'm actually working with the team right now to make our move to our first sort of squads with ownership of specific areas of the product. And hopefully we'll be doing this, within the first quarter of this year. But we're beginning to make that division so that we can have the startup within startup model, and so that the team, the engineers in the team, can work more on planning, estimation, and creating solutions. Whereas right now, because people are working on so many different things in the one team, it's quite hard for the team to plan and solutionize together, because there's just so much diversity of work across that team.
We have a tradition in the podcast that the guest introduces a book they enjoyed and presents it. And the one you sent us in advance of this recording is called Turn the Ship Around, from David Marquet. So, and it says Captain of US Navy, retired on the book cover. So can you tell us more about this book?
Yes. Yes, it was recommended by one of my CTO peers in this group that I was talking about before. And I'd wanted to read it for a long time, and it was sitting here. So when you asked, I said, okay, right, I'm going to read it. So I read it over the last couple of days. I absolutely loved this book. So it's the story of how this nuclear submarine commander David Marquet turned around one of the worst performing submarines in the US Navy, nuclear submarines in the US Navy, to one of the best, and in so doing had a huge impact on the way that the Navy operates. So it's got this really, there's a lot of
Yes.
tension, there's a lot of high stakes because they're on a nuclear submarine. But it's just so like our life as engineers. Everything you read, it just comes thick and fast. All of these truths about how you can help people to empower themselves, and then what you need to provide as a leader to turn people into leaders. And sometimes it's hard to explain. You think sometimes, why
Yes.
aren't people taking ownership? I'm giving people autonomy. I'm trying to, get people to take ownership. And people can't just take ownership if they don't have this, the support and the technical training and the clarity. And this book, just the thing I love, it's one of these, those books that you don't stop reading because there's a short chapter and you go, okay, just one more chapter. But there are just like every few pages, there are these really good, sharp, pithy statements, which just really, they put really well something which you know to be true, and they provide a really great way to explain that to other people. So yeah, I very highly recommend this book.
With that recommendation, I guess Gareth will have to add it to the reading list.
Yeah, well, actually, you're in good company because Matthew Whitworth, who I believe was the CTO or is the CTO of Tellurium, it was one of his recommendations from last year. So you're the second guest we've had on here to recommend this book. So yeah, you're in good company, I think.
It's definitely a classic.
And so one of the questions I wanted to ask you, just about, it was interesting. I think your company is probably the second or third I've heard of in this area, right? Of this providing these sort of global HR platforms, which is really interesting, and it makes perfect sense, right? So I've seen comments like, being able to hire from anywhere will be a major differentiator and a competitive edge, right, for businesses that are able to do it, which I tend to agree with. But I think the question I'm going to ask you is, do you think there are things that tech companies, perhaps especially smaller ones, startup, scale-up ones, don't take into account when expanding that way? Because it might sound great. Okay, I can go and find an engineer anywhere on the planet, but what perhaps do they not consider in trying to do something like that?
You can definitely make it work. Right? Lots of people are doing it, and have been doing for a long time. But I think it's similar, really, to the challenge that companies have faced following following the pandemic, moving from largely office based to remote and then to hybrid. In that you can make these things work, but it's hard work, and you have to work hard at and focus on building an effective remote organization. So our team, we're based in several countries, and we're all mostly remote. And I don't think the challenges we face are necessarily a consequence of sort of the locations and the backgrounds, of people from different countries within the team and different, working cultures. I think it is really just building a common purpose and, keeping the team tight whilst remote. I think that's the main challenge.
Yeah, I think the key phrase you had there was building a common purpose, right? I mean, I think that encapsulates it really well, I think.
Absolutely, and it's something we continue to work on. When we were together in offices, it was a lot easier a lot of the time because you could do shared activities. One of the things I find very hard to replicate is fortuitous conversations with people, just wandering over to someone and talking to them whilst you're having a break, and just finding ways to spark, ways to find those shared interests is something that I'm still, I still haven't quite got.
Perfect. Tim, I think we asked everything we wanted to squeeze out of you. So thank you so much for coming today to this podcast. And for anybody listening, we will be back in 2 weeks as usual. Thank you, Tim.
Hey, thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Tim.